Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, an exploration of strategy, leadership, technology, and entrepreneurship. Your host, Nectar, is the co-founder and partner at the PNR, a strategy consulting firm based in Montreal.
Strategy. A bit of a disclaimer before we start today's show. On this episode, I interviewed Mark Sherman, founder and CEO at Media Experts. Mark was one of my first bosses and was an extremely generous mentor and really helped me a lot in my career. So I'm a little biased in this conversation, but Mark was a person that helped me a lot. In this conversation, we really spoke about his entire career, how he started his first job out of school was in radio, how he launched Media Experts in 1981. We spoke about how they compete and specifically their competitive advantage and how it's not really such a secret competitive advantage and really relies around a customer first philosophy. We spoke about punching above their weight, how Mark was able to lead Media Experts to compete not just locally, but really across North America. And then we finished off talking about the importance of giving back and some of Mark's charitable work that has been, I think, under publicized. So that's it. I really enjoyed today's conversation. Mark was really generous with his time, and I hope that you enjoy today's episode. First question for you, Mark, is did you always want to start your own company at a young age, or is it something you just stumbled upon?
I guess I stumbled upon it. I had begun my career doing the ski reports at CHOM FM while I was in university. From there, I convinced the station manager that the radio station needed a promotion director, and I became the first promotion director at an FM radio station in Canada. Prior to that, FM radio stations were either playing elevator music or classical music, or in the case of CHOM, was a very underground rock station, very, very non-commercial in nature. And promotion and contests and things like that were the domain of Top 40 radio. So the station manager, a fellow named Craig Cutler, agreed to hire me as the promotion manager. And from there, I went into sales. And when I was in sales, I noticed that when I called on an advertising agency, that while they seemed to know something about creating messages, they knew very little about how to buy media or what they were buying. There was one particular instance where one of those agencies did not want to buy FM radio because he felt that people who listened to FM radio didn't wear designer jeans. And so I that was one of the absurdities that were formative for me. McDonald's didn't want to advertise on CHOM FM because of its reputation. And, my argument was, you mean its reputation for drug smoking? And I tried to argue that people who smoke drugs ate at McDonald's, and that people who found CHOM to be offensive would never hear your message on CHOM because they don't listen to it. And I was engaged in all these discussions with people who I didn't really think knew what they were doing. And an opportunity presented itself to open up an office for a Toronto media buying concern in Montreal, and I leapt at it. So prior to that and some events that happened at the radio station which discouraged me from a career in radio, I hadn't considered going into business. But there was a couple of discouraging events. The owner of the radio station appeared one night with his Swami, and he wrote on the walls of the radio station with a magic marker, like Cupid's hearts and Cupid's arrows. JWS was here July 17, 1981. And when I went to work on July 18th, 1981, I kind of realized that I didn't have a future with this company. And radio is not a very diverse industry. So in English Montreal, there are only 3 radio owners. And if you did a really good job, and I was doing a really good job at pissing off the competition, so it wasn't likely that if I left Chaume that I was going to get a job at another Montreal radio station. And that took me down this path of thinking about what I was going to do next. This opportunity presented itself to me, and I first went into business with 3 partners in Toronto and 1 partner in Montreal. That was in November of 1981. I was 25 years old, and I was encouraged by my father to do it. I went to him and asked him, what do you think about me going into business for myself? And he was very enthusiastic about that and felt that it would be good to be my own boss. And my father was in the jewelry business. He was an entrepreneur. He encouraged me. And so in November of 1981, there were 5 of us, 3 of us from Toronto and 2 of us from Montreal. After a period of time, there was only me in Montreal, and there was 2 in Toronto. So now we were 3 partners. The 2 partners in Toronto were not getting along. There was an advance made towards me to buy into the Toronto business and amalgamate the Montreal business and the Toronto business into one business. And I decided rather than do that, I would buy the Toronto partners out of the business in Montreal. And so in 1987, I went off on my own and changed the name of the company from Media Specialists to Media Experts.
Well, okay, I didn't know that part. So it took 6 years, basically. You were working with those partners.
Well, 6 years I had these partners, and I had been a radio sales rep, and they taught me how to buy radio, how to buy television, how to buy newspaper, magazine, out of home, and how to plan media. And these guys had a background in the media buying business. They came from media buying services, which ultimately became Mediacom in Canada. And they taught me the business. And then in 1987, about a year after I got married, so now I was 31, I bought them out, changed the name of the company to Media Experts.
Were there any lessons that your father gave you from, his, role as an entrepreneur? Are there any principles that, stayed with you while you were building?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My father was obsessed with quality. And my father would say that there's only one way to do things, and that's the right way. And so that left a very big impression on me and became sort of a cornerstone of my philosophy in business. My father was also very empathetic towards his employees, particularly his female employees, and gave them a lot of flex time when flex time wasn't a concept, to be able to juggle their family lives and their work lives. And he had a lot of women working for him, which was unusual in the 60s, as is the norm in the media buying business, where 80% of the staff are women, as you know. So attention to detail, doing things the right way, customer centricity, the customer is always right and the customer is king. All of these things, which are kind of the bedrock of Media Experts, they all come from my father.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a great explanation. I've never, asked you that question, so it's interesting to see how the role your father played in kind of building the DNA of Media Experts today.
Well, there's no doubt about that. And my father wasn't, a sophisticated businessman. He didn't go to business school, but while he was in the jewelry business, if you asked him what he did for a living, he would tell you that he was in the business of making women happy. So he was very consumer-centric at a time when most marketers were sort of manufacturing-centric. He understood that the customer was the ultimate place to focus, and he felt that he was in the business of making women happy. He also guaranteed his work for life, unconditionally. So if a piece of jewelry that a woman paid $8 for was accidentally dropped in a garbage disposal, clearly it wasn't a warranty item. The item had been misused. And I remember this particular experience where I opened up a return that came in because I worked there in the summertime, and I opened up a return that came from, I don't know, somewhere like Red Deer, Alberta. And I said, well, what do you want to do with this? This jewelry store in Red Deer is sending this back for replacement. And clearly this is not a warranty issue. This thing has been misused. And he said, we're going to replace it at no charge. And I said, well, why do you want to do that? And he said, well, if the woman was, so upset that she damaged her piece of jewelry that she wanted to have it replaced, I want to make her happy. She's a customer for life. And I said to him, well, what if the jewelry store, we replace it for free and the jewelry store wants to sell it to her and, at a reduced price or whatever? He said, well, that's completely in between the retailer and the customer. My merchandise is unconditionally guaranteed for life, and we're replacing it. Now, that commitment to quality is such that now, 60 years later, the jewelry that he made in the 50s, 60s, and 70s today looks brand new. And some collectors will pay $3,000 or $4,000 for a piece that originally sold at Eaton's for $24.99.
When you were 31 and you decided to start your own company, or not start your own company, but kind of go out on your own, mm-hmm. Was it a difficult decision? I know you're newly married, starting a young family. Did you find it difficult, or was it just a natural transition?
No, it was a very difficult decision. I was scared. I look back on that now thinking how ridiculous it was to be fearful. And I often say, I think Roosevelt said it, the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself. I was encouraged by a friend to do it. I did it. I wouldn't say that Media Experts is an overnight success story. There were many times over the years, it's now almost, I guess it's 38 years later from 1981. There are many times over those years that I felt down or discouraged or feeling like I wasn't achieving what I would like to achieve. But I put my nose down. I was very lucky to have a group of people who were very committed to me, committed to each other, and committed to the business. And slowly but surely, we built client relationships that led to other client relationships that led to other client relationships that led to reputation. And the business has never had a down year since its founding in 1981. We've had years where our revenue grew, our EBITDA grew 42% one year, more recently 23%. We've never had a year that was devoid of growth. We've never had gone backwards. And I would say through every one of those years, I was always fearful that everything could collapse around me at any moment.
You spoke about some of the the moments where you weren't satisfied necessarily, or you had fears or doubts. Was there a moment in time where the opposite occurred, where you're like, hey, we really have something here that's better when the competition is offering?
Well, there was a very pivotal moment. So in 1992 or 1993, a client of mine who had been working in the toy business became the president of Sega of Canada. And he came to me and said, in those days, there were no RFIs and there were no RFPs. If you had a good relationship with somebody and they moved to another job, they would call you up and say, hey, I need help. You helped me before. I need you to help me with this. So this fellow, Jeff, called me, and we became the agency of record for Sega of Canada. And we were tremendously successful, meaning their business was tremendously successful. And it was significantly overdeveloped in Canada versus the US. And the Sega had a reputation in the U.S. as being a mega marketer. They were on Sonic the Hedgehog was on the cover of Time magazine. Sega was the hottest advertiser in America. It was video games, and was a very important advertiser. And Canada was outpacing America and was further developed than America. And the Americans wanted to know what his secret was. And he told them that his secret was Mark Sherman and Media Experts. So he sent me down to meet the marketing people at Redwood City, California, and in the Valley. In those days, they didn't call it the Valley. And so I went to the Valley, and I went to Redwood City and Sega of America headquarters to this, and I'd never been to a huge advertiser before. And because that was the domain of the multinational agencies. And I reviewed with them what they were doing in media, and it was a horrible mess. It was a horrible mess. It was filled with practices that were kind of traditional, but made no sense. They just did things the way they did things because people did things that way, instead of taking the type of fresh look that I took at it. And I was able to kind of revolutionize how they were buying television. And at that moment, I realized that, the only difference between an advertiser in Canada and an advertiser in America is the extra zero. And that really we could bring value to an advertiser of any size in any market. And that was a really very, very pivotal moment somewhere, I don't know, 1993, 1994.
And you've always been customer funded, right? You've never sought outside capital. I'm sure you've had the opportunity to do so. So it's been customers that have been fueling your success.
Well, I would never think of it as being customer funded. I never thought of it that way, because once the customer pays me, the money's mine, not theirs. So I never thought of it being customer funded. But the nature of the media buying business is that you have a lot of cash flow and a lot of float. So because you're handling billings of $100 and you have fees of $5 to $10, you've always got this $90 coming in and out of your bank account. And if you subscribe to some basic business principles, one of which is collect fast, pay slow, you always have a lot of money to play with. So there was always plenty of cash flow in the business to enable us to buy any furniture that we needed to buy. The media buying business is not very capital intensive, particularly in those early days when there was very little technology. In the early days, the technology was a laser printer. And to start with, I would say our expansion was always self-funded by our cash flow. And then also comment that because this is a service business, not very capital intensive.
I want to go back to some of the principles that you mentioned, right, about the what makes Media Experts' DNA and what makes the organization successful, and has remained so successful for such a long period of time, which for me, the striking element is customer centricity. You mentioned the lesson that had been imparted from your father. It seems that it's such a simple lesson, but yet so still not applied across different organizations.
Well, I think under customer centricity or over it as an umbrella, is a notion of care. And you can articulate that as customer care. You can articulate that as caring for one another and your coworkers. You can expand caring to hashtag I give a shit. And we care, and we want to do good work, and we want to help our customers' businesses grow. That you don't see that kind of centricity every day, because it's much more difficult in a corporate environment to generate that kind of warmth and much easier in an entrepreneurial environment to generate that kind of warmth and to get people want to rally around a leader and an owner. And it's much easier to achieve that kind of caring in an entrepreneurship than it is in a big global company that probably has too much turnover in the executive ranks and where people, in spite of the best intentions, get treated like numbers. And it breeds people who lack curiosity and think of their work as a job rather than their life's work.
So in terms of talent and the leadership team you've assembled over the years, you have this incredible track record of people staying here 10, 20, 30 plus years with you.
Yeah.
Was it difficult when it came to selling the business or selling part of it? Was that a long time coming, or was it something that you had been reflecting upon over a shorter period of time?
When I turned 50, so that's now 13 years ago, when I turned 50, I started thinking about it. So, we all go through various stages of life, and some people have a midlife crisis at 40. I didn't. Some people turn 50 and become depressed. I wasn't. I was very satisfied at 50, but I started thinking about 60, and I started thinking about 65 and what I wanted to be doing. And I realized around that time what this business that I had built was worth in terms of what it represented on my statement of net worth. And then also I realized how fragile and what a house of cards that was. So most entrepreneurs, no matter how successful or how solid their business is, see their businesses as a house of cards. They're paranoid. They worry. They think if this happens, then that'll happen. And if those two things happen, then this will happen. And then all of a sudden, I have no more profitability. So when you're selling a business, the value of your business is a multiple of your profitability. And if I were to do nothing in terms of selling the business and at age, like now I'm 63. So if I didn't sell the business and I was 63 and I had an unfortunate turn of events, it might take me 10 years to build the business back up to the place where it was. And at some point, you just don't have the runway in front of you to be able to do that. And that became very apparent to me. It also became apparent to me that I simply needed to be more diverse in where my equity sat, and I had to divest and if I owned, that much stock in the Royal Bank of Canada, any financial advisor would advise me to divest, that I have too much money in one pot. So I felt I had too much of my net worth in media experts, that wasn't, in spite of my confidence in the business, that wasn't the safest place for it to be. And so I sought a transaction.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. And I could definitely relate to the paranoia element where you're just worrying about it constantly. And it's something that I still can't get over.
Well, and worrying, first of all, not anybody can be an entrepreneur because of that. And that type of stress can become debilitating after, years and years and years of standing in the shower with your head up against the wall, wondering about what if this happens and what if that happens, or, oh my God, this could happen. At a certain point, you want to crystallize your equity and lower your stress level.
I want to zoom out a bit and talk about your thoughts on the industry, media experts, and yourself in particular. I've always perceived you as being an innovator and thinking ahead of the curve, with trying, investing in startups and trying different avenues to create customer value. I'd like to hear where do you think we are today in terms of the media landscape, right? Everyone's talking about, the path where we've transitioned to quote unquote digital, but traditional media still, plays an important role. I'd like to just hear you on where you think we are today in 2019.
Where we are? Well, first of all, I don't really think of myself as an innovator. I think of myself as an entrepreneur, which by definition makes you an innovator. And I find that large companies stifle innovation and small companies nurture innovation. We were first to a lot of digital channels simply because we could be. So the nature of our business is such that virtually all of our competition was owned by large public companies. And those large public companies are very New York centric in general. And in some cases, they might be London centric, but they're very big market centric. And they're slow to disperse new offerings and new products globally. So my habit would be simply to read Ad Age and Ad Week and the Jack Myers newsletter and the Media Matters newsletter and try and keep myself as abreast as possible of the developments in the business. And I would see things that are happening in New York and try and move on them within 4 or 6 months. And that gave me a distinct advantage because my global competition would take 2 years to move something from New York to Canada. And that gave me an 18-month lead on search, on programmatic, on Facebook. I mean, we were the first advertising agency in Canada to seek credit from Facebook. You know, they wanted us to pay with credit cards because they had no credit facilities. They weren't set up to work with advertising agencies in Canada because they never had an advertising agency in Canada call them before. So all of those, that seems absurd, but it really happened. And it was just easy to be ahead of the competition because they were big and slow. Not because I was nimble and fast, although I guess you could describe us as nimble and fast in contrast, but it was more because they were slow than we were fast.
What do you think is occurring that, first of all, thank you for that answer. And like, I kind of lived my journey at Media Experts. I lived the early digital years where it seemed like it was evergreen, and there was just this runway where no one was doing any of the tactics, the strategies, from a digigal perspective. So we really seem to be innovating from that front, even if you don't like the word innovation.
The truth is we didn't get a lot of credit for it. I remember when we launched the first programmatic trading desk in Canada. There were agencies that didn't have trading desks that were upset that we said that because, well, they had a trade desk in New York. We didn't get we never really got a lot of credit for being first because it's much easier for an advertiser, for a manager to tell their employer that they hired a big multinational company than it is for them to tell their boss they hired a local independent company. Especially when you're dealing with new technology and new media, it's difficult for an advertiser, for many advertisers, to really decipher who knows what they're talking about and who doesn't know what they're talking about. So even though we were in front on a lot of these things, we didn't, I don't think, get the credit we deserve for that. And it took a long time to build our digital chops. And I'm proud to say that we're today, all those years later, is recognized as one of the leading digital media agencies in the country. I'm proud of that, but it didn't come easy.
Yeah. Well, also, I think you were going back to the principle of customer care, customer centricity. You were more worried about the value you're bringing for your customers versus tooting your own horn.
Well, yeah. I mean, I told somebody the other day that I was never in business for fame. I was only in business for fortune. So I wasn't really interested in tooting my own horn. I was only interested in serving my clients. And part of that was being absolutely certain that we had the latest leading edge capabilities, not necessarily as an offensive tactic, but as a defensive one, because I couldn't afford for somebody else to show up on their doorstep and say, well, we can do search engine search engine marketing for you, or SEO, or cost per click, or programmatic, or any of the new developments that were out there. So our willingness to engage and be first was to make certain that we were serving our customers such that doing the right thing for them would be doing the right thing for us.
What do you think is happening in the industry that you think is underappreciated or misunderstood?
Well, I always like to say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So there's this belief in attribution, which I continue to think is the holy grail of the media advertising business. I don't think we're any farther ahead now than we were in 1996. I really don't. There still remains arguments about attribution amongst digital channels. We're still arguing about that. We haven't solved for the role of offline media in digital performance. We haven't solved for the role of attribution in traditional media versus online media and how all of that really works together. We know it works together, but that's become and remains more of art than science. And it's a myth that digital media has attribution. It's a myth. There's nobody in the food chain that really agrees on it. And we have a lot of work to do. And so, yeah, I think attribution is a bit of smoke and mirrors, a bit of a myth. And yet there's a lot of people who think that we've advanced a great deal in the last 20 years. And I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's still the wild, wild west. Having spent a little bit of my life playing with that concept of attribution and having been a practitioner, it was just so broken. It's just a question of systems. Like the systems don't talk to each other well, and also competing interests, amongst the big platforms themselves that don't share the data in the accurate way. It's just, I don't see any way that it could be solved in today's landscape.
Well, ultimately, the math will be there to understand what all the variables are, which include consumer behavior, weather. There ultimately will be in a place where all the variables are understood, all the variables are measured, and we can really, truly understand what's happening. But I think that remains the holy grail and a long way off.
Maybe a final question, Mark, or one or two, if you have time. Something that you don't speak up a lot about publicly is your charitable endeavors. So giving back. I know it's an important part for you personally. So I'd like to hear about a little bit about what role it plays in your life in trying to give back to the community.
Well, there's two parts to that. So one part is what I do personally. And that's simply sharing. So I think if you're lucky enough to achieve some level of financial success and fortune, then it's incumbent upon you to do whatever you can to help cure the world. And then I've tried to involve that in the culture at Media Experts, because I noticed along the way that most people become very communally aware around Christmas time. It seems that many people think that around Christmas time, it's nice to think about giving money to the poor, but people don't tend to think about that 12 months a year. And so accordingly, I thought it would be a good idea to create good deeds committees at Media Experts. And all those good deeds committees come under the umbrella of caring. Not just caring for the customers, not just caring about doing good work, but also caring about others. And we've been successful at creating a a culture of community involvement at Media Experts that I think brings value to the work experience here. I went to a fantastic Google event called Zeitgeist, which I think you're probably aware of. And I heard a fellow named Arthur Canada, speak there. He is a fellow that started a school in Harlem. And he said something very interesting. He had a room full of what was supposed to be North America's 400 leading CEOs. But I was there, so that couldn't have been the criteria for being there. I think it was North America's, Google's top 400 customers were there. And he said that a business should have two sets of statements. A set of financial statements that should be reviewed monthly, quarterly, and annually, and a set of social statements that should be reviewed monthly, quarterly, and annually, and that those statements should coexist, that being socially responsible is good for a business and can contribute to its profitability. And I really, really bought into that and believe that to be the case, that it's good for a business to be socially responsible. It makes people feel good about where they're working. It brings them together, not just working, in our business on a client project, but also working on a fundraising project and doing what they can in their work life to change the world a little bit. Government is not going to solve all of our problems. And there is power in a collective. So if you're a CEO, if you're an entrepreneur, if you have people working for you, you have a collective that can do things to change the world. And those people will feel good about doing that and will feel good about working for a company that encourages them to do that. So it's a win-win for everybody. The employees win, those in need win, your financials win. It's a perfect storm, and it would be, I think, a waste for any business not to engage their collective in some kind of social advocacy and some measures that help to cure the world, because the world needs curing.
I think, Mark, this is a great place to close off. So I just want to thank you for your time. I appreciate the insights, and particularly the last statement was really heartwarming. Thank you.
Heartwarming. Good. I'm happy I made you happy.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Don't miss an episode by subscribing on iTunes or Google Play.